Hi again, Year 12. Just a video to go through the main parts for Lesson 4, which is talking more about the eruption and the different impacts that it has on the two towns. Because they're in different locations, the effects are quite different. There's some things that you need to know to differentiate the effects between Pompeii and Herculaneum. So the first bit of the reading just talks about how pretty much at this time, the people didn't actually know that the volcano was a volcano. They just thought it was a mountain. So no one thought that it was ever going to explode or that it was a danger. And even though they had experienced earthquakes and tremors before, they didn't actually connect that with the volcano or the mountain. They just thought that that was like an omen from the gods. So when it did explode, they were quite shocked. The statistics of the actual eruption are now known from studies done by volcanologists. So we know that the cloud of ash and smoke was rising up to heights of 30 kilometres. So it's this massive cloud coming out the top. It would have been really scary. The molten rock and pumice that was ejected was at a rate of 1.5 million tonnes per second. So there's a lot of material being spewed out from the top of the volcano, which was also highly dangerous. The thermal energy released was 100 times greater than the atomic bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. So if we think about how devastating that was, even though that was man-made and this is natural, it's still greatly, there's great impacts. We don't know the death toll. We haven't found all the bodies. There's only been parts of Herculaneum excavated. Although most of the main city centre of Pompeii has been excavated, there's also these two towns of Pontus and Stabiae, which were nearby, that were completely buried, and they've never been excavated. There's modern towns now built over those, and we can't get to them. So we don't know the death toll, but we know it was large and that no one really did survive. Okay, the phases of the eruption. So there are two key terms that you must know, and you'll need to add them to your glossary. That's a pyroclastic surge and a pyroclastic flow. They are different, even though they've both got that same first word. So volcanologists, they're people who study volcanoes, have looked at the stratigraphic analysis. So you'll remember from year 11 that strata is the layers in a dig site. So they can study the different layers when they've excavated, and they can actually analyze those layers and they can tell what type of material was coming out at what time. So because of this strata, we know that they were both pyroclastic surges and pyroclastic flows. So a surge is a low density turbulent cloud of hot ash and rock that billows over the terrain, barely touching the ground. So you might remember, if you watched the animation yesterday, you could kind of see at the very last stage of the animation, there's this really strong, I guess, cloud of gas that's moving so quickly, and it doesn't happen until the very end of that animation. So we only see the first surge in that animation. Basically, it's like this really fast moving cloud of gas, and we now know that that probably killed everyone instantly. So it's traveling at about 300 kilometers an hour. That's really fast. Now the flow is different. It's more like what you think of when you think of a volcano erupting. That slow flowing molten material, like lava almost. That's a pyroclastic flow. It's much denser. It's hotter. It's more like a ground hugging. So it's not, a cloud going over the top of through the air. This is on the ground, actually coming down the mountainside. And it's all of those rock, pumice, gases, what we would probably call lava. Sorry. And it's only moving at 50 kilometers an hour, so it's slower. Okay, you could outrun that probably. Whereas pyroclastic surge was unavoidable. So what we know from studying the strata is that there were 6 different layers that tell us that there's 6 surges. So 6 times there was these surges of material from the volcano, killing everyone pretty much instantly, depending on how far away you were from the volcano. We know that after that there were a few flows, but the 6 surges are clearly visible in the strata. So make sure you add these 2 terms to your glossary and that you know the difference between the 2. Okay, let's have a look at different effects. So even though the volcano is erupting, Herculaneum and Pompeii experience different effects because of their location. So Herculaneum's very close. It lies directly under Vesuvius, 7 kilometres from the peak. So it's really close, and therefore it actually has more significant impacts. So it's a much more horrific fate than Pompeii. People of Herculaneum would have been terrified from the initial explosion. They would have felt the shock waves and the earth tremors very, very quickly. Because it's upwind, however, even though it's close, there's a different wind blowing, and it kind of blew all of the pumice and rock that initially came out in the first few hours over the top, and it landed heavier on towns further away like Pompeii. So even though it's close, at the start it didn't experience too much damage. That means that most of the buildings are intact because they weren't getting these heavy stones falling on them and destroying their roofs and having them collapse. But in Pompeii, they did experience that. So that comes into different remains when we study them later on. Okay, the next and most destructive phase of the eruption is, really harsh on Herculaneum. They're getting the full brunt of these pyroclastic surges. The very first surge, arriving no more than 5 minutes after the collapse of the eruption column, dumped 3 meters of hot ash on the town, and the following 5 surges and flows would have then destroyed buildings, but it carbonized timber and other organic matter. So in the animation yesterday, you would have saw the fires that were catching light, because when these hot stones come out of the volcano and land on a building, they catch a light, and a lot of the materials made from wood would have burnt, and this all happened before the surges and the flows. So in Pompeii, you will not find any remains of carbonized timber or any sort of living things. There's only very few organic remains in Pompeii because they all got burnt in the early fires. Herculaneum didn't get those fires because of this wind. So the remains in Herculaneum are more intact, and we have good evidence of timber. So lots of upper story buildings with timber balconies. There's a lot of food remains in Herculaneum, but we won't find them in Pompeii. So that's one different effect that we've noted so far. Once all the surges and the flows come, the city, because it's so close, is buried in a depth of 23 meters of volcanic material. I'll just scroll down and show you this diagram. So this is the best diagram to give you a visual of the different effects of the eruption. So Herculaneum's buried in up to 20 meters roughly of different material, and you can see the layers here, the different strata. So because it's close, if you want to dig the remains of Herculaneum, you've got to dig 20 meters deep. But Pompeii's further away, so it doesn't get as much ash and buildup of material in the end, and you only have to dig about 4 meters if you want to get to the remains of Pompeii. So that's another big difference between the effects of the eruption, 20 versus 4 meters. Okay, so Pompeii, because it's a fair distance from the volcano, it actually escaped the first 2 surges. It doesn't have as much strata as Herculaneum does, and we just saw that. So the people have lived probably a little bit longer because they haven't experienced the first two surges. The third probably stopped at the Herculaneum Gate, which is one of the entrances to the town on the Herculaneum side. But the fourth surge, reaching temperatures of 400 degrees Celsius, penetrated the whole town, and this is probably the one in which everyone died. There were two more surges after this fourth one, destroying anything that's sort of left, but the people probably died on that fourth surge. Okay, causes of death. Originally, we thought that they were different, and this is a new interpretation from new evidence. So because we've gotten more advanced, we've been able to confirm cause of death, and we now think that cause of death is thermal shock. So the initial reaction of the people to the eruption determined their fate. If they did run away, they might have survived, but we don't have anyone who says, I ran away and survived. So it's probably likely that they didn't get away. Those who stayed in their homes in Pompeii might have died. We've got about 600 people who we could know of that perished when the roofs collapsed under the weight of the pumice and the rock that came in those initial phases. So the bones that have been found there tell us that they died from, the weight of their roofs collapsing. If they were outside and they didn't die from falling rocks and all those sort of things, then the fourth pyroclastic surge would have been the one that killed them. And some of the people may have died from asphyxiation. That's what we originally thought. Asphyxiation is like choking on the fumes. But the main cause of death now is thermal shock. So thermal shock is pretty much, it's quite awful, but the temperatures that you're experiencing of this surge, 400 degrees Celsius, that's too much for your body to handle, and you instantly die. All of your, skin and organs, everything just vaporizes into thin air because you can't handle that amount of heat. So you pretty much die instantly. Okay, we think that's the main cause of death now. Okay, Herculaneum's different. Until recently, we thought that nearly everyone had escaped because there's very few skeletal remains that we found. However, we've now discovered another 300 people who were sheltering on the beach in boathouses. So here is a picture of these skeletons which were found in boathouses. So probably they didn't leave. They might have sought shelter there. We also thought that they died from suffocation initially, but we now know that it's thermal shock as well. There's a good article here which proves this new cause of death, and it's important to know that we originally thought that it was suffocation for about 2 centuries, but we now know that that's not true. It's because of this new evidence we know that they caused instant death from this filament or thermal shock. Okay, that's the main information that you need for this dot point. You have to now go and complete some Cornell notes. I've highlighted the main points. I've let you know what to put in your glossary. Comparing is probably the best thing to do. So talk about the phases. So remember, Pompeii didn't experience the first 3 surges. The fourth surge was the surge that reached the city, and that's the one that caused the most damage. Whereas Herculaneum experienced every surge because it was so close. So there's some things you could say. Different causes of death, they're actually both now quite similar, except Pompeii might have had a few more people die from collapsing roofs and things like that. The difference in cover, 20 metres versus 4, 20 versus 4, pop that in. And then also the condition of the remains. So remember, in Pompeii, lots of the buildings are destroyed by fire or damaged from collapsing roofs. So the remains are not as good as in Herculaneum, because in Herculaneum we have a lot of carbonized timber and they weren't damaged in those early phases of the eruption.